Hi, everybody. It is Tuesday afternoon. We just got done with co-op a little bit earlier today, and now I'm back sitting in the sanctuary in the sound booth recording the video that will introduce you to Shakespeare. Shakespeare is probably the greatest literary figure in English literature. He is the man. He is the bard. You don't really have to say, the guy from Stratford upon Avon, because when you say the bard or the poet, basically everybody knows who you're talking about. He is amazing. There's no one else that comes close to Shakespeare, except maybe Chaucer. And, really, yeah, it's Shakespeare. Way, way more prominent, way more beloved. Okay. He wrote, like 154 sonnets, 38 plays that were either comedies, histories, or tragedies, and he wrote two longer works of poetry that are just long poems. They're not meant to be performed dramatically. They're just long poems. But let's back it up a little bit, because we've been talking about Chaucer in the Middle Ages, and so at the end of that era, we talk about the Renaissance being the end of the Middle Ages when we talk about Florence. Okay, because when we're talking about Italy, then this is how history begins and ends. We've got the fall of Rome, the end of the Golden Age of Rome, the Dark Ages in between, and then we get to the Florentine Renaissance based around the city of Florence, Italy. And that's the new flourishing, the second golden age. And so you have these two bright lights, and in between you have the Dark Ages, okay, which were neither dark nor really troublesome. But instead, when we talk about England, we talk about the Norman conquest of England when the French took over, being the end of the Anglo-Saxon period and the beginning of the medieval period. And when you're talking about most of Europe, we talk about the Middle Ages being like 1,000 years, roughly 500 to 1,500. For England, it's barely 500 years. It's more like 485 or 420, something like that. Math sucks. That's why I'm an English teacher, not a math teacher. But essentially, it goes from 1066 to really like 1485. At that point, you have 1066 is the Battle of Hastings, wherein William the Conqueror, William of Normandy, came in and took over the place. And after that, for like 500 years, 420, there's this weird kind of French dominance, although English kind of picks up. And strangely enough, the main conflict during that time is called the 100 Years' War, which is actually 117 years, but at that point, who cares? Between England and France. Because the French king and the English kings, they all had like shared stock. The king of France had tons of land in France. Actually, in times he had more land in France than he had in England. Than the king of France had. So they go back and forth, and they end up having this war that lasts for 117 years. And at the end of that time period, you had these two English royal houses, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, that end up in kind of a civil war. They're fighting each other to be kings. And one house had as their ensign, think about family crest, little shields, got the logo on it, they've got the motto over the top. One house had as their logo a white rose, and the other had as their logo a red rose. And so this conflict between the houses of Lancaster and the House of York was known as the War of the Roses. Now, so you have Lancaster and York fighting it out, and who wins? Henry Tudor wins. That's who. Yeah, I didn't see that one coming. Neither did they. But in 1485, the Battle of Bosworth Field, you have Henry Tudor, who wins and becomes known as Henry VII. He was the seventh king with the name Henry before him. So Henry VII takes over, and he's He's notable because he's the first of the Tudor kings, first of the Tudor monarchs. But that's kind of it. Really, the one who's actually remembered in history is his son, Henry VIII. And then after Henry died, there was a brief period when his son, Edward VI, took over. And he was young and weak and ill, and he didn't last very long. And actually, he didn't really reign on his own. So when Edward VI died, his half-sister, Mary, took over. This is the woman who brought the Catholic Church back into dominance for a few short years and murdered all sorts of Protestants. Murder, it was a rough time. They were a lot of people who are considered martyrs today. In fact, Fox's Book of Martyrs came about at this time, sort of honoring the dead who were executed by the order of Mary, who became known as Bloody Mary because she killed so many people. This is really sort of the Protestant point of view on her. The Catholics look at her a bit differently, as you might expect. In any case, she came out of power, and her sister, again, half-sister, Elizabeth, came to the throne. And Elizabeth became known as Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. She reigned for this incredible long period of time, and that time was a really fantastic time of arts and culture, and she was very fond of all that kind of stuff. And that's the era that we bring into the Elizabethan theater and Edwardian theater and all this kind of stuff that comes up. And it's very, very successful at this time. And that's the time that Shakespeare comes in. And Shakespeare comes in and he is able to sort of capitalize on this, first as an actor, then as a playwright, then as a theater owner, which is how he really made some serious money. And he was an absolute genius. Okay, there's so much that he did, which contributed to the way we think and speak now. He's just the mountain around which everything else are just hills. Okay, so he was born in a small community called Stratford-upon-Avon, which was the river that ran through the town. There's several Stratfords in England. And so this one is Stratford-upon-Avon as opposed to Stratford-upon-the-Thames or something else. He was the son of a glove maker, so they often refer to him as the glover's son. He married very young, around 18. He married a woman who was older than he was by probably 8 years. I think she was about 26 when they were married, and she was pregnant at the time. So take that for what it's worth. He had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and the son died, although we don't know how. His son was named Hamnet, and one of his greatest tragedies was the tragedy of Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, and there has to be some connection there. There's a very, very dark play written just after the death of his son. Obviously, there's a big connection there, some great catharsis and grief that he's going through. When we'll talk about plays in a little while. My intention is that we spend 6 weeks on Shakespeare, 1 week on his sonnets and a sort of loose introduction to him, and then we'll spend 1 week on each of the acts of Macbeth. So we'll talk about Macbeth and plays a little later. Right now, we want to talk about his sonnets. Okay, so I'm going to post or link a video that I want you to watch. It is a crash course on sonnets. It's not the greatest thing ever, but it's a very good general opening to it. It talks about rhyme schemes. It talks about meter. It talks about the structure of sonnets. And that's really important because that'll give you, like it says, a crash course in Shakespearean sonnets. So it's really hard to talk about this when you don't have a board and you don't have it on the board so I can like highlight the stressed and unstressed syllables and break it down into the various different iambs and even write iambic pentameter down on the board so you know how to spell it and break it down in its component parts and you can see what that is. But this video does an okay job of it, and we'll talk more about that next Tuesday after you've read some sonnets, and we'll break it down and go through the rhyme scheme and the meter, and we'll go through those. One of the things that they say in this video, which I disagree with, is the idea that the overwhelming majority of these sonnets were written to a dude, and that Shakespeare was gay. Okay. Certainly some of them were written to a man. Okay. That is beyond a doubt. Some of the poems that he says are written to a man, I don't see. Okay. They may be in with a group that are typically ascribed to this, but I don't see this poem in its own content as having been written to a man. But that's beside the point. If he wrote love poems to a man, does that make him gay? No. One, they're not exactly love poems as like we think of a love poem. As we would never write a love poem to a friend. Okay, I'm not going to sit down and scribble out a sonnet to one of my buddies. Okay, but that's kind of a modern thing. Okay, and honestly, there is probably some sort of a reaction to the rise of the homosexual agenda that makes that not okay. Guys can't express manly friendship in anything that gets anywhere near a romantic way because, well, you know what that means. And honestly, we can see this in The Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of people who raise an eyebrow at Sam and Frodo and are like, oh, yeah, you know what? Well, Tolkien would have never thought that. Okay, that was the farthest thing from his mind. And you go further back and, these things are not ideas that are generally accepted. And reading modern tendencies into things that were 400, 500, 1,000 years ago, this is not really an appropriate thing to do. There were places where you could have still gotten killed for doing something like that. So, even into the 18th and 19th centuries, people were being executed in Western cities. Not talking about the Middle East where they're still doing it, but like in Europe, they were doing that. So the idea that he was really out there was probably not the case. What's probably more likely the case is that he was mercenary, meaning he would write a love poem for whoever paid him. Because, nowadays we've got YouTube, we've got followers, we've got people who, you click like and subscribe and videos are monetized and you get 1,000 people watching your video. You got, a couple pennies for each time they see it, and it adds up. And there's thousands of people who make a living off of YouTube, which just bumfuzzles me. I'm completely amazed by that. But back then you had to have somebody who thought, wow, your stuff is really good. Here, I'm going to pay for you to live. And you only had a couple of them, so you really had to impress him. If that dude said, hey, write me a love poem, and you said, yes, sir, what would you like me to say? And that's kind of the case. At least that's how I think it is. Now, it's 400 years ago. Who knows? Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But it's not something that there's enough evidence to say one way or the other. Okay? We know he had a wife and children. And we know that he spent a lot of time in London away from his wife and children, and that he had a kind of theater goer's reputation. So, maybe he had a couple of affairs. Who knows? We know that he left his wife his second best bed when he died. The will leaves to his wife, whose name, by the way, is Anne Hathaway, like the girl who played Catwoman in the Christian Bale Dark Knight movies. His will leaves her his second best bed. That's disappointing. Anyway, I'm running out of time. I'm going to have to break this video down into 2 sections, and nobody wants that. So look in the details below, and I will give you what you need to read and a couple of videos for you to follow up on. And then when we come to school next week, we will go ahead and talk about these in more detail, and you'll be far more familiar with the sonnet and Shakespeare. Have a good week, guys. God bless.